in order to expedite implementing her policy, she had to get rid of any barriers. One of the major barriers to her master plan was to get rid of the union.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Our first guest this morning is going to be Cathie McQuiston. She is Deputy General Counsel for the American Federation of Government Employees. Cathie, thank you for taking the time to talk to us this morning. I really appreciate it.
Yep. Good morning. Glad to be here.
Good morning. Good morning. So you're here to talk to us about a big win for workers at the Department of Education. But let's start with this. Can you tell us what the Department of Education does? Why do we not want to, let's say, abolish it?
Sure. I mean, the Department of Education basically, as a broad matter, sets education policy for the U.S. The two largest segments of employees are in federal student aid. And so obviously those folks deal with loans for education and dealing with the contractors who service those student loans. And the other largest single group is the Office of Civil Rights. So those employees investigate and enforce civil rights, Title IX, those kind of things, investigate individual schools or complaints.
And that sounds like pretty important work, right? We definitely need those to keep the education system running.
Sure, absolutely. The employees are very dedicated, especially in the Office of Civil Rights. You have a lot of attorneys who have left law firms and private practice because they believe in the work of enforcing civil rights and protections for students in our schools. So yes, it is very important.
And the lawsuit, the settlement that y'all were able to win, it stems from actions under the Trump administration and Secretary of Education Betty DeVos. But before we get to those specific actions, can you talk to us about some of the other ways that she, through her position as Secretary of Education, kind of sabotaged public education? You know, that's all. We spoke on the phone yesterday about how a lot of times Republicans will come in and they will appoint people to head agencies that they literally want to destroy. They literally want to abolish these agencies. And, you know, she comes from a long line of school privatizers in Michigan. So what were some of the ways that she tried to sabotage public education from her position that aren't implicated in this settlement that you're going to be talking about shortly?
Well, I think she, as you mentioned, she has a long, well-documented history of hating public education and of hating unions from her time before she was confirmed as secretary. So she, elevated from a policy standpoint a lot of the religious education and elevating those policies that were important to her, which, overarching was the weakening of the department itself and its oversight authority, whether it was a civil rights or what have you. And that was a key reason that she tried to get rid of the union, because the protections we had in our contract, as well as our employees, were, as I mentioned earlier, very dedicated civil servants to the cause and believe in the right to public education in this country. And in order to expedite her policies, implementing her policies, she had to get rid of any barriers. And one of the major barriers to her sort of master plan was to get rid of the union.
And so that's a really good segue into what we're here to talk about today. Y'all were able to win a big settlement. And so a lot of that has to do with an imposed contract that, was in violation of the law. And that was really geared at destroying the union. So walk us through some of that backstory.
Sure. So the agency and the union had been started contract negotiations in late 2017, early 2018, and the agency never actually met with us to bargain a single time. And instead of March in 2018 said that the union was bargaining in bad faith, even though, again, as I mentioned, we had never met and we had offered to meet. We had dates scheduled, and then the agency unilaterally canceled that bargaining. They wrote what we refer to as an edict, a totally management authored contract that essentially waived all of our statutory rights under labor law and imposed that contract. And so that single incident led to a series of additional violations that occurred over the next approximately 3 years. And that's how we ended up with the litigation was surrounding that core issue.
And presumably they had some sort of, what was their reasoning for their saying that we have this ability to just impose unilaterally a contract on y'all?
They claimed falsely that it was the union was refusing to bargain with them, which, wow. You know, when the Federal Labor Relations Authority is the federal sector version of the NLRB, and they investigated those allegations and found them to be without merit. And so that's why they issued complaints against the department. It was a total of 14 unfair labor practice complaints over the 3-year period, starting with their unlawful imposition of the contract and further unlawful actions taken after they were trying to rely on their unlawful contract to do things further on. So those were also found to be violations.
And so let's talk about some of those things, because you mentioned that the imposed contract at the Department of Education really served as a tool, as a guidepost for the Trump administration, the way that they acted towards federal employees across the rest of across other agencies. And so what were some of those, what were some of the violations that stemmed from that imposed contract, and how was that replicated across the federal government?
Well, to be clear for everyone about what the further actions were. So that contract was imposed in March of 2018, and then in May of 2018, just before Memorial Day weekend, the Trump administration issued a series of executive orders that applied government-wide, that severely limited the rights of unions in the federal government. And so the contract, you know, being issued about 2 or 3 months right before that action took place, government-wide, the actions the Department of Education took were actually more harsh than what ended up being imposed government-wide. You know, some examples of that is that they removed all of our employees who were members from dues deduction membership, union membership. The federal government is an open shop, so no one has to belong to the union, but the agency over a 2-year period systematically dropped people from their union membership through payroll deduction without their knowledge or consent. They expelled us from our union offices that we had bargained the right to have on agency facilities so that we had a location to meet with employees that we represent. And they also revoked our what's called official time, which is time under the federal labor law that unions have to do representation work. And so the department gave our union representatives no time at all of any kind for years. So this was a strategic, large-scale plan to bust the union at the Department of Education to get us out of the way so DeVos could have a clear path without objection or opposition to implementing her anti-public education policies.
Right. And so what are the ways that these things that were taken from workers and you know, from the union what are the ways that actually helps the agency helps the agency execute its mission, right? Because the one of the stations that we're on is a conservative radio station. And so there is, among some of our audience, there's a certain amount of anti-union, anti-government inclination. And so when they're hearing, I can just hear some objections from folks in the audience thinking that the ability for union or for workers to represent each other in disputes with management, that's just something in the way of the agency executing its mission. You know, all of these things that they got rid of are just roadblocks that are, you know, but actually, you know, it's our view that having these things does actually help the agency execute its mission and serve the people of the United States. And so walk us through why not only would workers at the Department of Education not want these things removed, but why would it be that you know, just a random citizen in the United States that relies on the Department of Education for this or that thing, why would it be that they would want a functioning and active and powerful union for the workers there?
Well, I think as a general matter, all the union is the voice of the workers. It's not a third party entity, right? The leadership, it's a democratic organization. The leadership of the union is elected from among the workers at the Department of Education. And so these are the people that know what's going on the ground. Whereas higher level people, Betsy DeVos and people like that sitting in Washington, don't necessarily know, because the Department of Education actually has offices across the country. So not everyone is sitting in Washington. They're sitting in Dallas or Atlanta or Denver, Chicago, places like that, doing this work. And I think that, again, I mentioned part of their mission is a civil rights mission. It's protecting the rights of students. And those, from the conservative angle, those rights can include, for example, religious expression and prohibitions on expressions of religious expression and not being able to discriminate against people for those expressions. And also for, you know, student loans don't have political lines that I'm aware of, certainly. And so, especially as this administration works to forgive a lot of the loans, if that's able to move forward, I mean, that's a huge undertaking, a lot of behind the scenes things that have to go on, and we want it to go smoothly and we want it to go well. And if whatever's happens is allowed to go forward, then you want it to be smooth and you want it done right. And the way to do that is to hear directly from the workers about what that'll take. The union isn't just necessarily about disputes with management. It's also about, the federal government has a long history of what's called labor management partnership, where the leaderships of the unions and worker representatives sit down with leadership in an agency and, you know, talk about issues, resolve them informally to avoid the kind of litigation we ended up here with in you know, the last 3 years until the Biden administration came in.
Right. Yes, that's definitely an important part, and I think that in the federal government, the labor and management cooperation, it even makes a lot even more sense than it does in the private sector, because the dynamics between labor and management, I think, really are at least a little bit different in the federal government. I remember when I was hired on, actually, part of my hiring panel was also coworkers. It wasn't just management that interviewed me. It was other coworkers, and that's something that I would like to actually formalize in our contract. I think that's just something that has come up over the years at my agency, but I'd really like the next time we sit down and negotiate our contract to get that formalized, because I think that that's a really cool thing for the workers to be able to be involved in the bringing on of new employees. And so this settlement, what is it, and how is that going to help the workers at the Department of Education moving forward?
Well, the settlement does a lot of things because there were a lot of cases involved. institutionally for the union, it reinstates us to the place we were entitled, had bargained to be in, as far as reinstating our offices. It reinstates the employees to dues deduction. It pays us back the monies we're owed for the time. And given the number of employees and the amount of time, that money is over $500,000 we're owed. It also requires bargaining over things that the agency had refused to bargain over. So telework, Betsy DeVos had done a number of reorganizations, which by law, the agency was required to bargain the impact and implementation of those reorganizations with us, which they refused to do during DeVos's tenure. So they have to now bargain those with us, because sometimes they put, for example, employees in new jobs that they don't have any training for, they don't have any background in, and it's sort of setting people up to fail. And the union, when it bargains, it calls for appropriate training and things like that to avoid those kind of problems for individual people. So there were some individual grievances against employees where they were denied leave and things that they were entitled to. So basically the settlement, which was very wide ranging, addressed sort of a host of issues that I've just summarized.
Right. Cathie, really appreciate your time this morning. Is there anything else that you feel like our audience ought to know about this issue?
No, I think we've covered most of it. Appreciate the opportunity to discuss it and talk about Department of Education's work.
Cathie McQuiston is Deputy General Counsel for the American Federation of Government Employees. They are the largest federal employee union, representing over 700,000 federal employees across the United States. Cathie, thanks for taking the time to talk to us this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.
Which side are you on?